Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to welcome you to today's session on a topic that's critical to successful clinical development, selecting the right CRO at the right time. My name is Indrė Dryžienė, and I'm Head of Clinical Operations Project Management at Biomapas. I have been working in clinical research since 2004 across a variety of leading roles. I'm very happy to facilitate today's discussion. And I'm pleased to introduce our today's guest speakers. So we have Samson Fung. He's an experienced clinician, medical doctor, and C-level biotech executive with over 30 years of experience and leading in oncology, immunology, early and late phase clinical development, translation medicine, regulatory and medical affairs, and market access, biotechs in startups, and advanced stages such as Micromet, as well as global peer pharmaceutical companies such as Roche, Novartis, Pfizer, Novo Nordisk, and AstraZeneca. Samson is managing director of his strategic consulting firm, Fung Consulting, and was founder and CEO of Volvox Therapeutics, founder and chief medical officer of Susavox, both oncology biotech startup companies located in Munich and Cambridge. Thank you so much, Samson, for accepting the invite for this discussion. And we also have Artūras Pažera, who is a senior clinical project manager at Biomapas. He has been with Biomapas for the last 6 years, focused on early phase development for our biotech sponsors. He has over 15 years of experience leading global project delivery. Artūras is also one of the key members of the clinical strategy team, advising and supporting sponsors on the best countryside strategy for their protocol and objectives. So thank you so much, both of you, for participation. And together we will explore how timing and strategic selection of CRO can impact the success of clinical trials, especially in early phase biotech development. Samson, could you share your insights? What's the most common mistake biotechs make when planning their first trial? What is your experience?
So biotechs usually come from academia, or the most of their leading people are not extremely industry experienced, in particular with respect to clinical development, clinical trials. So one of the biggest mistakes that these young companies usually do is they go for the big known names, which is usually the globally operating clinical research organizations, the big CROs. This is not always the best choice because they are small customers. They have usually very specific programs, very specific wishes. There's lots of science involved, and those big organizations are generally not very well set up to serve smaller clients, to go for very special scientific wishes or scientific programs, and also it's a small customer. They usually have big customers. They do care very, very well for bicontinental, tricontinental studies with 30, 40 sites across 6, 7 countries. That's what they know. But for small clients with 3, 4, 5 sites with very special scientific questions, they sometimes have not the A team, but the B or the C team to serve these clients. So that's the problem, I would say, because the bigger the customer, the bigger or the better the team. Now they tend to also exchange their good people from the team after the initial phase and withdraw them for another bigger client. So they usually do not end up with the A team, but with the B or C team. And that's not good for the client, because the client needs continuity. You need to have the same people all around. They need to be dedicated, particularly with respect to many of the scientific questions. biotech companies need to answer in the early phase, such as biomarker development, certain specific questions with respect to other endpoints than the usual endpoints like safety or efficacy. There are always very special questions that authorities, but also clinicians, the community, would like to be answered. And that is better with smaller organizations. I would say smaller or mid-sized biotech. That depends.
Yeah, thank you, Samson, for sharing your experiences. That brings us to the next question. At what point should you start thinking about a CRO partner?
That's another area where a lot of mistakes are done. At least you should start thinking and considering at the earliest time possible, which in my experience means even before you think to start about your GLP tox. Obviously, most of the clients have CMC issues first, and then the preclinical program, and then the tox program. Before the tox program is started, you should at least consider and start to discuss with CROs, because each CRO has its specialty. They have also maybe good vendors that can already give very good advice for your tox program. So you should be starting to think as early as possible. It doesn't harm. Starting late always means, oh, the time is running out, the budget is maybe running out, and this is no good.
Yeah, I completely agree. And Artūras, what's your view, especially from the project delivery standpoint?
Thank you, Indrė, for inviting me to this conversation, and Samson. So now from my side, being a project manager, but also involved in the proposals review and preparation, we see that sponsors come to us as a CRO at very different stages. But honestly, as Samson mentioned, the sooner we can join together, maybe not so early as Samson mentioned, but at least as a CRO, we would prefer that when the protocol starts to be developed, and if we are involved, then the more impact we can make together. And a protocol is not to be underestimated. Sometimes it can take a year to finalize a good protocol. And if you as a sponsor involve the CRO only once certain issues appear, you've already lost a lot of valuable time. So, my experience is that please don't underestimate how much input is needed to create a rather good protocol. Think of your CRO not only as a vendor, but really as a partner who can walk the path together with you. And, I've seen sponsors, as also Samson mentioned, from academia, often scientists who previously probably ran only investigator-initiated trials or similar. And we see quite often the assumption that it's going to be just as simple or straightforward. However, it's not, especially, when they start to go international to some other countries. And this is exactly where having the right partner early changes the game and can help moving forward a lot.
Thank you, Artūras. So once timing is clear, the next big question is, what should you actually look for in a CRO, especially for early phase studies? Samson, what are the top 3 things to look for when you're evaluating a CRO for the early phase studies? What are your view?
I would say the most important one, there's many, of course, but let's talk about the most important ones. The most important one is previous experience of the CRO in that field, which means you cannot really successfully run an oncology study if you do not have experience in conducting oncology studies. Each field is very special. It's quite a difference on whether you do an antibiotic study or a diabetes study or whether you do an oncology study. So the CRO must have experience in that field. Otherwise, this is the best tool for failure. Ideally, of course, the company would also have experience in the specific, let's say, in indication. This is not a must, but it would be an asset For example, if you had a solid tumor study, most of the phase 1 early studies are not a single indication, but multiple indication studies. You have colorectal cancer, GI cancers in. So the company should have, the CRO should have some experience in that one of those indications. So that's number one. The second one is they should have some geographical presence in the respective geographical area. Usually first in human or early studies are done in 2 or 3 countries. So you should have geographical presence of the CRO in at least half or 2/3 of those countries. Sometimes, for example, if they are neighboring countries, it doesn't matter so much. Like if you do a study in Belgium and the Netherlands, or in Belgium and northern France, obviously it doesn't matter so much on whether the CRO is sitting in France or in Belgium, but it should be somewhat close to the cultural area where it is, because you would realize over time that medicine is also a cultural issue. And that's very, very, very important for a success of a study, that some of your people come from that culture, because then it makes it much easier for your vendors, for the community, for the sites, and so on and so forth. And the third one is the CRO should have good vendors. Big CROs have all the vendors somewhat in-house. But that also creates their own issues. Smaller CROs are more flexible, but they should have good vendors, and you should well control your vendors, because the vendors themselves can be good advisors. I mean, a vendor who has done scientific investigations for 20 years, they know what they are doing generally. And they can also be good advisors to the project. It's not just an arm, it's also a little bit of brain involved from the vendor side. So if the CRO works well with the vendors and the vendor has good quality, that's can be a very efficient team.
Thank you so much for your insights. Yeah. Let's shift to the scale. How do smaller CROs compare to global ones when it comes to early phase oncology? Samson, what are your thoughts and experiences on that?
Oh, my experience reaches back to nearly 40 studies over my career, out of which about 26 are early studies, first in human or phase 1. There's about 6 to 7 big phase 3 studies. My biggest phase 3 study was 120 sites across 4 continents. That was a huge study in transplantation. The smallest study was 2 or 3 sites in 1 country. So you see the entire spectrum. I think it's very important to observe the 3 golden rules. Rule number 1, costs. Rule number 2, time. Rule number 3, quality. So let's first go for the costs. Cost is always an issue, particularly for not so cash-rich biotech companies. And that's a very critical factor, because your investors are very critically looking at where and how you spend your money. Large CROs have their own advantages. One of their disadvantages is that they have a huge overhead, whereas smaller CROs have a smaller overhead. Now you can ask yourself, why is an overhead important? Sometimes if you have large studies, it can be pretty messy. It makes quite a difference whether you have Chinese sites versus US sites and then a site in Brazil. So that's why you need some supervision. For smaller studies, you don't need that. Smaller studies are generally conducted in, let's say, 2 to 3 countries. Let's say Poland, Germany, and maybe UK. For those, you don't need a big overhead, because this can be very well controlled. These are only few countries and few sites. Of course, overhead unfortunately needs to be paid. You know, someone always needs to pay people. I once had a study with a mid-sized CRO. This study was conducted in Belgium and France. It was a phase 1 study. For some reasons, we needed to go to South Korea and open 3 South Korean sites. We engaged a large CRO because there's not many European CROs that deal with South Korea. So in the first coordination meeting, we had 2 people or 3 people from the from the main CRO, and the big CRO came with 12 people, out of which 8 were coordinators. I don't really know what they were coordinating. At the time, I was the responsible medic, but after the end of the discussion, and they had weekly meetings and so on, and I thought, oh wow, this is pretty heavy. I understand they need to coordinate, but who does pay them? And obviously the budget tripled just for those 3 sites. I mean, this is just an example. You know, every CEO may not want to see this, and you really have to talk to your investors if you want to do such a thing. So that means you should go for small study, small CRO, huge study, huge CRO, with some exceptions, but that's the rule. So the cost is important. Second, the time. As a small company or mid-sized company in a huge organization, I'm a small client. I'm not important. The big pharma companies with billions of dollars budget, they are big clients. They get the best team, and they get immediate access to the senior management of the CRO. As a small client, I can shout and I can cry, and I will always never succeed more than to get the middle management, which means, and there's always opportunities for contacts. For example, you're being delayed a little as a small biotech because you're waiting for funding, public money from EU or your national organizations, and that needs to come a little later than you would like to start a study. In a smaller mid-sized CROs, you can talk to the CRO and say, could you already do a little bit of pre-work and then wait? Then because we have to wait with the contract until the funding is there, because these are the funding rules. For large CROs, they don't care. Smaller CROs, you can eventually get direct access to the senior management or to the president and discuss with him. And they are usually, I've never seen them not to be flexible. So that's very, very important. Time is money, but also flexibility is money. And the third one is quality. It's usually something that is not the top priority for the CEO, but for the clinician, for the CMO and the CSO. These are very important issues. The quality is if the CRO has a good contact to their vendors and have their vendors very well under control, then your result can be even better, or let's say not better, but let's say it can come quicker and more individualized solutions to be found than with a big organization, because big CROs also go for big vendors. That's obvious. Whereas smaller CROs can go for specialized vendors with a lot of specialized knowledge. So you always have to keep in mind, what's the purpose of your trial? What's the endpoint of your trial? The endpoint of your trial in phase 3 is acceptance of your dossier, registration. Your endpoint for your early study is, where's your biomarker program? Is it well done? No, are your biomarkers well positioned? And there, smaller CROs are more flexible and usually are also more, let's say, keen to adapt to the customer's need.
Thank you very much for sharing your experiences. Artūras, how does this align with what you have seen when supporting sponsors in early phase oncology?
No, I really can relate to what Samson said, because I'm also coming, most of my career I spent in a large global CRO, and I've done a couple of big fishes, phase 3 as Samson, but maybe I even had 1,000 sites in a study. So really big one. So I can really compare after being in the large CRO and now coming to a smaller one. What stands out to me in early phase studies and in this smaller mid-sized CROs is flexibility, first of all, what I see. It's faster decisions and easier access to senior leadership, what Samson mentioned. I think that's one of the main things I see being in the project management leadership. And in fact, in smaller CROs, even the CEO often knows every project, not even speaking about middle management. And sometimes they know it personally, which makes escalation, problem solving much quicker to what I've seen before. Another big difference, which I notice, is the relationship building. I think this is where I see that smaller teams mean that they can really focus on the sponsor needs, and also in addition maintain direct communication with the sites. And even all sites can be visited for several times together with the sponsor and project management, which you cannot achieve somewhere else. So for early phase studies, where the number of sites is usually limited by itself, however, this connection can really make a big impact. To large CROs can also deliver in these areas, especially when studies are small. But specifically for early oncology, I found that smaller CROs can often provide that extra level of attention, flexibility, and speed, which at the end really makes the difference for the smaller players.
Thank you, Artūras. That naturally leads to the next question.
Sorry, maybe Samson wanted to say.
Yeah, maybe I will just add something to what Artūras just said. The flexibility is a key for your success, particularly in the early phase studies, because science progresses. Even during the study, science is being done. So all of a sudden, the scientists come and say, "Oh, I had another idea," or we have made another finding," or someone else had another publication. So we need to build this in. You can do this as well as for any CRO can do this.
Yeah.
Larger CROs sometimes tend to not be very enthusiastic about it, let me say it like that, because their vendor says, "Oh, this is not in our normal program, so we will need a while for that." Whereas smaller CROs with their respective vendors, they are often far more flexible. They say, "Okay, we can do this during the course of the study. We will not need to stop the study or halt the patient recruitment for a while." And you know how critical patient recruitment always is, but particularly for early studies where there is fewer patients, but there is far more attention for each patient. A phase 1 patient requires the same attention like 10 phase 3 patients in a big phase 3 study, because all those pre-work, the scientific pre-work, has basically been done in the phase when the program reaches phase 3. So that's what to add on what Artūras just said.
Thanks, Samson. And I know that sometimes it sounds like a broken record, flexibility. Everyone is flexible.
Yeah.
I can really compare, because sometimes the bigger companies are just set in the way that they cannot change the processes, right? They need to follow certain processes, and bureaucracy is high. While in the smaller company, not only the smaller teams give more attention, but they have more freedom to be flexible and attend to some things. So I think for the smaller studies, this is exactly where it matches most.
Correct.
Thank you so much. It was a great discussion. So let's move to the next question. So when does CRO size actually matters and when doesn't? Samson, what are your thoughts? Because we talked a lot about the small ones and what are the differences and what are the advantages. So when the size matters?
Well, a little bit of this has already been touched by Artūras and me previously. To say it again, smaller CROs can manage a big study, and big CROs can manage a small study. There's always ways. It's just you were asking a general question on what my experience is. My experience, but you do not want to find this out in your study. You want to be relative. I mean, of course, if I've worked in big CR in big companies. They sometimes have 2 or 3 phase 1 studies, 8, 9, 10 phase 2/3 studies in parallel. If one study is a little tricky or you mess it up, it's painful, but it doesn't kill the company. In smaller companies or in smaller biotechs, 1 or 2 studies that fail, not because of the science fails, but because some operational issues fail. That can be the end of the program and be the end of the company. And there's more than enough examples to this. So that means you don't want to experiment for the moment. You can experiment when you have enough money. That doesn't matter. But not when you only dependent on 1 or 2 studies. Then you do not want, both should be successful. You do not want to experiment.
Yeah.
So that means go for the lesser risk. And the lesser, of course, also a cost issue, as I told you before. So the lesser risk is in a small study, go for a smaller CRO. Tailor exactly what the CRO's offer is and what your needs are. First, you need to find out what your needs are. I often see that customers don't really know what their need is. So they should talk to the CROs and try to find out, we didn't know that we need this and this and this. So they should talk early. I mentioned before the GLP talk starts, talk early, because then it's better for your budgeting. It's better for your timelines, creates more confidence of your investors. It's more than clear. And you find out what your true needs are, because you may think this is my main need, but it may not be your main need. So this is easier somewhat with smaller CROs. The most of the smaller studies, like those phase 1, first in human, are done in 2 countries, 1 to 3 countries, with around 2 to 5 sites. Sometimes a little more, sometimes less, but that's it. For that one, you don't need a huge CRO. You need a small but very focused CRO, and then comes all the aspects that we discussed before: flexibility, easy access to senior management, hopefully very good vendors. I know that smaller CROs are more open to transparency. They would flag out their vendors so the sponsor can check the vendor themselves. Larger CROs rather tend to be a little more hesitant for that, which is understandable. So there's a lot of those things. So I would say, but a smaller CRO can also manage a mid-sized study across 2 or 3 continents. It matters on whether you have a good cooperation partner and how well you coordinate yourself with the cooperation partner. I have done that too. Studies in Europe done by the main CRO, some US sites done by a cooperation partner. If you have a good cooperation partner and it's a long-standing, trustful relationship, that's always a critical thing. But that, it's the sponsor's task to find this out too. But they can also manage that. But if you go for 3 or 4 continents like Artūras with his 1,000 sites, or me with the transplant study in more than 100 sites, there sometimes it's you need a little bit of buffer, a little bit of weight. Sometimes then a large CRO has its advantages.
Yeah, and most probably also the culture matters, because as being a smallest or mid-sized CRO working with a biotech who are also smaller, so culturally it's easier, less bureaucracy in both of them, so it's easier to get quick connection and to solve the issues. And if working the same, so as you're mentioning, for very big studies, when you work with big companies, usually this is done by big pharma companies. So these different levels, which we are discussing, also is a part of culture which you're having to.
Yeah, because in big companies, you usually have your operations, let's say in China. Then you have Chinese people that the local CRO, the big CRO, the local people can talk to the Chinese people.
Yes.
Whereas the ones in Poland can talk to the Polish people. But for a smaller CRO, sometimes that's a little tricky. you would need to have a Chinese CRO as a cooperation partner and have a good understanding between, and that's what happens also a lot. A European CRO goes with a Chinese CRO because there is a rule that in China they won't listen to Europeans. The Chinese doctors only listen to Chinese people. That's somehow true. So that you need a cooperation partner, but it can be done.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Let's move to another critical element. How early regulatory scientific advice shape the course of the trial? What are your experiences on that?
Oh, the experience, it's actually one of the most important things that you need to observe when you are a biotech or a small company. And there are a lot of painful experiences. Nowadays, the entire clinical or also preclinical or even CMC development of pharmaceutical agents is very, very, very well controlled by the authorities. Sometimes you have everything all right, but the CMC still has an issue. The authority says you don't need to hand in your clinical trial application. There's still an open issue with the CMC. You have to wait. And then you're ready to run. Your sites are done, but you still have to wait for a few months until the CMC issue is solved, which means talk to authorities or better via a regulatory person. I know regulatory people are expensive. That's why go for a good regulatory consultant. That can be a good regulatory consultant within the CRO, depends, or a freelance consultant. You don't need a CRO sitting in your office besides you. The regulatory consultant sitting in the office besides you. You need that person from time to time. Eventually, in a month, maybe 1 or 2 days. But these 2 days can be extremely important because he will tell you this is not the right time to submit, or you need to explore this, or there is a new regulation coming up. And regulations are coming up all the time. Not every few years, no, every few months. And they have, number one, the right language. Number two, the right their connections to some of the CROs that they have worked with, some of the regulatory authorities that they've worked with. So you should always start the process early with regulators. And as I mentioned before, also with the CRO. It doesn't say, I don't say you need to sign a contract very early, but you could have first, let's say, contact. And of course, there's always the option, to not pick that CRO and go for another one if you may have to make some compensation. But you should, just because of not wanting to sign an early contract, should not be a hindrance to talking to these providers, to the CROs, to the regulatory consultants, and so on.
Yeah,
that's very important.
I would add, Samson, that it's also not a must to sign the contract for the whole study from the beginning. I mean,
exactly.
It could be totally different partnerships, starting, with the small things, and then, setting up and understanding, each other's needs and setting the whole contract. So it's always advisable.
I've built a house in where I live, Munich area. So we went to an architect. The architect made a perfect concept. And we only paid for that concept, but not for the entire project. But later on, once we picked him, we could have picked someone else, but he was convincing, so we picked him. Then what you made as a prepayment was amalgamated in the final big budget. That's what people often do not know, or they are afraid of that. You can make an initial payment. And if you finally go with your future partner, then it goes into the big pot, basically, But that's things that often are not decided, or your CSO, the scientific officer, doesn't want that, and the CEO doesn't know that. So sometimes, there's also communication gaps within the same company. So you so the client, the sponsor, also needs to define exactly what their need is and when they need, and then drag on those people that are important. And the important people to talk to in the very early phase, of course, it's your scientific people, it's your CMC experts, it's the regulatory expert, and the CRO. And sometimes I have seen excellent regulatory experts in CROs.
Yeah, thank you so much, Samson, for your valuable view. Artūras, how does this translate into planning and delivery from your experience with biotech sponsors?
But the one example comes into my mind, that as mentioned, we would like to be involved as early as possible from the protocol. But in one of our recent trials with the ATMP, the Advanced Therapeutic Medicinal Product, it was the first study of its kind in that country. It was a personalized vaccine, something, We agreed with the sponsor together that it would be good to approach the local authority for the scientific advice before moving into the full submission. It wasn't early, Samson, as the GLP toxicity stage, but still early enough, that it could make a difference. The advice was received, and it was beyond only the study design. It covered very practical but critical aspects like, whether ATMP was documented correctly, whether the submission package met the regulatory expectations. And, I think that there were a couple of things achieved by doing this. This step gave the authorities an early opportunity to familiarize themselves with the product and the study itself. And that dialogue really helped. The sponsor was very happy and they got clarity on the requirements. The regulators also were well prepared because, this was the first in their country. And then, at the end, the study was approved within the timelines without any delays or rejections that who knows but might have happened otherwise, And I think this was very not only smart by the sponsor, but also, giving everyone a chance to get aware, and everything then were very smooth. I mean, I understand there is not always time for this, but I agree, Samson, that sometimes it's underestimated, and and this can cost a lot, because sometimes running too fast might have issues in the study, and then it's really much more difficult to track it back. So if possible, the earlier as possible, pick CRO as a partner, or even if we don't have a certain advisor ourselves, but we can find ways or recommend, or go to the authorities and help with the ways on how to get advice.
Yeah, to add to what you just said, you're completely correct. I mean, sometimes with smaller CROs, my experience is you get through to the regulatory people much quicker, because sometimes I had cases where we were trying to catch the regulatory person from the CRO, and then they said, yeah, I have another time slot in 2 weeks' time. You don't want to wait for the 2 weeks. You want him tomorrow, best case, or in 2 or 3 days. And really that happens. You won't believe it, but it does happen, because they are overloaded, of course. There's specialists and there's not many specialists running around. So big studies, many problems. Do you do the study in India? You have different issues than in China and in versus Poland or California. I mean, you can already see that it can be complicated for the regulators. So you want to have easy access, quick access to the regulators, to the regulator in the CRO or your regulator consultant and so on. So that's number one. And number two is you don't want to have an RFI, a request for information from the authority, in the middle of your already getting prepared, because that can push you back for 2 or 3 months in Europe. You don't want that. And this is deleterious because time is money. And also, the doctors are hot for inclusion of the patient, and then you tell them, you need to wait for a while. This is no good. So, and that's what my pledge was, to go early, to approach a CRO early, without a lot of costs. Because then they tell you, you need to keep that timeline because you need a little longer because of those new regulations. You cannot anticipate that a biotech company knows about all the regulations that come from the authorities. I mean, they are published, of course, on the EMA website or FDA website, but who has the time and also the understanding on reading those and knowing about the impact on their particular study? So this is a very complex, it's like a machinery, like a complicated car. And if one of those components does fail or doesn't work well, then the entire machine cannot run. So that's why, and that's one of the mindset things for smaller biotechs, is they still keep them for themselves. They don't go out to CROs or to other vendors or specialists at an early stage. That's why I'm always pledging. And you're right, Artūras, it's not a matter of timing. It can be, sometimes it's a little earlier, sometimes a little later. It's individual per the program, but they should think about it. So they are already win when they think about it. And then they should have always the first contact to one of the institutions I mentioned, because if they find out, oh, we're too early, okay, no problem, we can wait for another 2 months. But if sometimes, most of the times they come and then they find out, oh, we should have done this half a year ago. And half a year is a lot of time within a study. It's a lot of time for investors. It's a lot of time for a biotech company, because half a year, your financial runway of a biotech is always limited, and half a year does mean a lot.
Yeah, I completely agree, Samson. So thank you all for your time and thoughtful contributions. It's been a pleasure to facilitate this discussion. And I truly appreciate the insights shared by you, Samson and Artūras. And I hope that today's session provided valuable perspectives for your future planning. Looking forward to continuous conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.